versus a former president. And it's a very close race. I know a lot of you have questions about how American elections work. So we're bringing you a special broadcast. How does the Electoral College work? Why does America always vote on a Tuesday? And why immigration is such a big debate this time? We'll be answering all these questions tonight. So let's get started. 240 million people are voting in this year's election, but the US president is not chosen directly by the voters. It's not a popular vote. Instead, they're chosen by the Electoral College. You see, each American state has a fixed number of electoral votes. That's according to the state's population. Whoever wins the state wins all the electoral votes. The Electoral College has a total of 538 votes. A candidate needs 270 or more to win. So it's a complicated system, and one that's gotten some pushback in the recent years. We'll tell you why.
On the 5th of November, millions of voters in the United States will cast their ballot to elect their next president. However, there's a catch. The world's oldest democracy does not hold elections which can be considered as the easiest to understand. In fact, the American voting system is quite complicated. Now, most democracies in the world follow something that's called the popular vote, where voters directly cast their ballots to a political party or leader. It's a direct transfer of the vote from the voter to whoever is on the ballot. But the United States does not follow this. In fact, it's the only democracy in the world that has an indirect voting system called the Electoral College. Simply put, the Electoral College is a process of voting. It's not really a college. It was established in 1787 AD and was included in the US Constitution by the Founding Fathers. The Electoral College is basically the selection of electors who are called delegates. On the 5th of November, when Americans will queue up to vote, they won't actually be voting for their next president. Instead, they'll actually be voting for delegates who represent their respective states, and these delegates will then vote for the president. So, how does the Electoral College work? The Electoral College is made up of 538 delegates. You must be wondering where the number 538 comes from. It's the number of senators and representatives from each of the 50 states. The breakdown of 538 includes exactly 100 senators, 2 from each state, and 438 representatives from the 50 states. Each state's number of representatives is based on its population. Let's take a closer look with an example. California and Texas are the two most populous states, and so they have a higher number of representatives. However, regardless of the population of the states, each of them gets 3 votes to start with. The remaining are then added depending on the population of the state. However, that does not mean that the states with a higher population enjoy more voting rights. In fact, it can be quite the opposite. Let's take the example of 2 states. The population of Texas is over 29 million. On the other hand, Alaska has a much smaller population of just above 700,000. However, each representative from Texas and Alaska roughly represents the same proportion of the population. So, as Texas gets 38 representatives in the US Congress, Alaska gets 3. And this makes voting different in Texas and Alaska, because each of the 38 delegates from Texas now represent roughly over 760,000 people. Meanwhile, each delegate from Alaska represents over 250,000 people. Basically, it takes 760,000 people from Texas to get 1 vote, but it just takes 250,000 people from Alaska to get that same 1 vote. So the vote in Alaska can be considered a lot more influential. When Americans go to polls in November, they aren't exactly voting for the president directly, but their state's representatives, whether that's Democrat or Republican. And then these delegates give their votes to the presidential candidate from their party. Whichever candidate then wins the majority in a state, no matter how big or small it may be, wins all the electoral votes of that state. And in total, to win the race to the Oval Office, a candidate must win 270 and more votes across 50 states. So when Americans say this,
I love her. I am so glad to see a presidential nominee who is youthful and joyful, and I think that reflects right back onto the Democrats. My first time voting in a presidential election, and I could not be happier.
I don't know the exact numbers, but I know the last election, I think Trump got like 88 or 90% of the vote here. I think he's going to get that again.
The courts will take care of that. Let's take care of him in November.
What they really mean is that they will vote for the delegates who represent their political party. And then those delegates will vote for the presidential candidate from their respective parties.
Kamala, you are fired. You're fired. Get out. Get out.
It's time to turn the page.
However, the delegates don't have to necessarily vote for the candidate that the population wants to give its vote to. In fact, electors are free to vote against the wishes of the people. And this is despite having been elected as a delegate by the voters. So, with how complex the electoral system is, should the US continue with it or adapt the much simpler popular voting system? A survey from 2023 shows that a majority of Americans want to do away with the Electoral College. A Pew Research study shows that nearly 2/3 of US citizens want popular voting. Americans say that it would truly reflect the mood of the nation for who should sit in the Oval Office. That's because a presidential candidate could win the popular vote, which means that more people voted for them, but they could lose the presidential race due to the Electoral College, where the victor is decided by the number of delegates and not the votes of the people. The Pew study has some more insights on the issue. It says that Democrats are far more likely than Republicans to support moving to the popular vote. On aggregate, over 80% of Democrats say that they would like to have the popular voting system in America. In contrast, about 45% of Republicans share the same sentiments. Moving away from party ideologies and towards demographies, almost 70% of Americans under the age of 50 prefer the popular vote. On the other hand, Americans who are 65 and older want the Electoral College to continue.
A very nice call from Kamala.
The current system allows a candidate to lose the popular vote, but still win the Electoral College. This occurred both in the 2000 and the 2016 elections, which were won by George W. Bush and Donald Trump, respectively. However, the only way to change the Electoral College would be through a constitutional amendment. But amending the Constitution is a Herculean task. The last time it was done was in the year 1992, and it was about raising salaries for congressional lawmakers. So, for now, it looks like Americans will have to keep voting using the Electoral College to elect their president.
Now, America has 50 states. Some of them are red, which means that they've always voted Republican. Some are blue, which means they vote for the Democrats. But some of them are called swing states. They either vote the Democrats or the Republicans. They keep changing. These swing states decide who becomes president. And there are 7 of them. Our next report tells you all about them.
Trump, make sure he does face a consequence, and that'll be at the ballot box in November.
Kamala mentioned my name, I think, 21 times. She didn't mention the border. She didn't mention inflation. She didn't mention anything but my name over and over and over again.
The countdown to the 5th of November is on, with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump vying for the Oval Office. So who will become America's next president? While around 240 million people will vote to pick the United States' 47th Commander-in-Chief, a relatively small number of them are likely to settle this pivotal question. A handful of the 50 states could hold the key to the White House. These are called the swing states. As the name goes, they could swing either Democrat or Republican. They're also known as battleground states or purple states. They could potentially be won by either candidate. So parties tend to spend disproportionate amount of time, resources, and energy on bagging these states. One way to identify swing states is political realignment, and the other is tight margins in races. In 2020, the states that voted for current President Joe Biden, who's a Democrat, but chose former Republican President Donald Trump in 2016, have been highlighted as swing states. They are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. These 5 states, along with North Carolina and Nevada, were won by a margin of 3 percentage points or less. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump's campaigns have been at full throttle to win over the voters in these states. Let's look at each swing state in the 2024 US presidential election. Arizona, also known as the Grand Canyon State. In the 2020 race, Arizona, for the first time since 1996, voted to back a Democrat. For decades, the state has been characterized as red, but Joe Biden flipped it by about 10,000 votes in 2020. The state borders Mexico, so it has been at the center of a raging immigration debate. The issue has been a top concern among voters. Though border crossings have fallen in recent months, they hit a record high in December 2023 and January 2024. But Donald Trump has repeatedly attacked Vice President Harris on the current administration's record on immigration. The former US president has also promised the largest deportation operation in US history if he's back in the White House. Apart from immigration, abortion access has also left Arizona divided. State Republicans attempted to bring back a 160-year-old near-complete ban on terminating pregnancies, but the move was foiled. Next up is Georgia, the Peach State. It's a critical battleground state for both leaders as they struggle to gain the voters' attention. In 2020, Joe Biden flipped the state, which was held by the Republicans since 1996. Biden won the state by a 0.2% margin. Though the margin was too little to call it a decisive win, it was key to Biden's path to the presidency. It was here in Georgia's Fulton County where Donald Trump was accused of election interference, landing him in one of his 4 criminal prosecutions. Trump and 18 others have been accused of conspiring to overturn the narrow defeat in the state. He, however, denies any wrongdoing. A third of Georgia's population is African American. The state has one of the country's largest proportions of Black residents. Analysts say this demographic was pivotal in Joe Biden flipping the state in the last election. Moving now to Michigan, the Great Lakes state. It has picked the winning presidential candidate in the last 2 elections. Michigan had been reliably blue since 1992 after voting exclusively Republican in the 1970s and 80s. But in 2016, it turned into a major battleground after Trump won there by less than 11,000 votes. In 2020, Joe Biden swung the state back to blue with a wider margin. But currently, the state has become symbolic of countrywide anger against President Biden due to his support for Israel in its war against Gaza. During the Michigan Democratic primary contest in February, when Joe Biden was still running for a second term in office, over 100,000 voters chose uncommitted on their ballots. Kamala Harris has taken a slightly tougher stance on Israel. But whether it will be enough to change the voters' minds, well, we'll find out in November. Next is Nevada. The silver state has been a more traditional example of a swing state. In the last 4 elections, the state voted blue. But Nevada voted Republican from the 1960s through the early 2000s. The only exception was Bill Clinton, who won the state in 1992 and again in 96. Experts say there are signs of a possible return to its Republican roots. Both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are hoping to win the state's sizable Latino population. Unemployment is also one of the major concerns here. The state has the highest unemployment rate in the US at 5.1% after California and the District of Columbia. Then there's North Carolina, the Tar Heel state of the old North State. Since 1980, it has voted Republican in every single election except 2008, choosing Barack Obama. In recent presidential contests, the victory margins have been razor thin. In 2020, the victory margin in North Carolina was just 1.3%. Poll pundits say it will be a toss-up in November, since the race is extremely tight with no clear winner. The sixth on the list of swing states is Pennsylvania. With 19 electoral votes, it's the most important swing state this November. The Keystone State clinched the presidency for Joe Biden in 2020. The big question is, can Kamala Harris keep it blue? Both sides have campaigned hard in the state. Donald Trump even survived an assassination attempt here after a bullet dodged past him and hurt his ear. Donald Trump broke the blue streak in the state with his 2016 victory. But 4 years later, in 2020, Biden secured a blue wall that also included Michigan and Wisconsin. Now, Trump is hoping to lure Pennsylvania voters back. The seventh and final one is Wisconsin, the Badger State. It also picked the winning candidate in both the 2016 and 2020 elections, but only by a margin of around 20,000 votes each time. Since 1988, Wisconsin had been a reliably blue Rust Belt state. Trump broke that streak in 2016 and turned it red. Analysts say it's states like Wisconsin where an impact could be made by third-party candidates. Among them is Green Party's Jill Stein. The Democrats have been fighting to remove her from the ballot in Wisconsin, saying that the Green Party did not comply with the state election laws. Republican candidate Donald Trump has described the state as really important. He said, and I quote, "If we win Wisconsin, we win the whole thing." The Republican National Convention was held in Milwaukee. Kamala Harris was also rallying in the same city when the Democratic Convention nominated her as their presidential candidate. In the United States, when a sitting president is up for a re-election, fewer states tend to change parties. In the past 8 US presidential elections, the 1992 election had the highest number of states that switched sides. 22 states flipped. It's often called the year of political realignment, when Democrat Bill Clinton defeated incumbent President George H. Bush. In 1992, states including Colorado, Maryland, and even California, which had voted Republican for years, chose to go blue, and then reliably stayed that way for the next decade. Can 2024 be another year of political realignment in US history? Well, we'll find out on the 5th of November.
Now let me ask you, who will be able to vote in the upcoming US election? Now, this question is not as simple as it seems. You see, more than 350 million people are living in the United States, but this includes green card holders, international students, and illegal migrants too, which is, by the way, a hot button topic in this election. Out of the 350 million people, only about 240 million people can cast their vote in the upcoming election. Does that include migrants? Why is citizenship a raging debate in the US presidential race? Also, what role does race play in this election? Here's a report.
As borders are, Kamala threw open our borders and allowed 20 million illegal aliens to stampede into our country from all over the world.
Every U.S. citizen has the right to vote. And this year, every eligible voter's ballot will decide who will be the next U.S. president. The 2024 race for the White House will see over 200 million Americans cast their vote.
I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
However, there are over 350 million people living in the United States. So why isn't the number of eligible voters higher? And is voting restricted only to American citizens? Voting is a fundamental and guaranteed right to citizens of the United States. Only they are allowed to cast their ballot to be eligible. Here's what the requirements are. A person has to be a U.S. citizen. This could be through birth in the U.S., through birth overseas to parents who are U.S. citizens. Then there is the process of naturalization. It is the process of voluntarily becoming a U.S. citizen, and then you also have to be 18 years and older on voting day. If you meet these requirements, then you may register to become a voter and cast your ballot in the U.S. elections. So U.S. citizens can cast their vote and pick their next president. They can also pick their governors and mayors by voting in the state and local elections. But what about those who are not U.S. citizens but are living in the country? This includes people who are in America on work visas or those who have acquired lawful permanent resident status, also known as green cards. But what about the 50 million international tourists and the 1 million plus international students? And millions of illegal migrants? Can these people also cast their vote? Here's what the rules say. Lawful permanent residents or green card holders cannot vote in the federal elections. This includes the presidential, Senate, and House of Representatives races. Additionally, green card holders also cannot vote in state elections. That's because most U.S. states follow federal law. However, green card holders can exercise their voting rights in certain towns and cities where local law allows them to vote. States like Maryland and Vermont allow green card holders to vote. However, U.S. federal law allows green card holders to participate in other political activity. This can include volunteering in political campaigns or advocating for social issues. And what about the others? Well, apart from green card holders, international tourists, students, people on work visas, or illegal migrants cannot cast their ballot in either the federal, state, or local elections. However, they can take part in political events and campaigns, but only as volunteers. This brings us to the question, why is citizenship and voting a raging debate in the United States? It all started in February, when Tesla CEO and tech billionaire Elon Musk sparked a debate on his social media platform X. He questioned U.S. President Joe Biden's migration policy. Musk said that Biden purposely had weak borders so that millions of illegal migrants could enter the U.S. Musk added that the Biden administration would fast-track citizenship for those migrants and create a permanent majority, a one-party state. The billionaire said that this was the strategy of the Democrats to ensure that they win the 2024 presidential race. Musk's tweet was not taken seriously at the time, but that all changed in June, when Joe Biden announced that he would give citizenship to 500,000 people who are undocumented spouses of Americans but have been living in the United States for over 10 years and more.
Today I'm announcing a common sense fix to streamline the process for obtaining legal status for immigrants.
And that's when the Republicans jumped on the matter. At least 16 Republican states are suing the Biden administration for this move. Elon Musk says the Democrats are importing voters. The Republican-led states argue that Biden has bypassed congressional laws to fast-track citizenship for blatant political purposes. However, the Democrats have hit back. Vice President Kamala Harris has called it Republican strategy to tear apart families. Harris has accused the Republicans of hindering the process of legalizing the migrant status of millions.
Donald Trump believes a border deal would hurt his campaign. So he ordered his allies in Congress to kill the deal. Well, I refuse to play politics with our security, and here is my pledge to you. As president, I will bring back the bipartisan border security bill that he killed, and I will sign it into law.
This brings us to the question, how easy is it to get voting rights as a migrant? And will Biden's citizenship policy benefit the Democrats? Joe Biden's citizenship eligibility program for spouses has crucial details about becoming a citizen. The program allows undocumented spouses of Americans who have lived in the U.S. for at least 10 years or more as of June 17, 2024. To apply for citizenship, they should have no criminal history and will have to provide extensive documentation of taxes and their marital status. Once the application is approved, the qualifying applicant will have 3 years to obtain a green card or risk deportation. And after getting a green card, they can apply for naturalization or full U.S. citizenship. This means that the almost 500,000 spouses of Americans will not be eligible to vote in this year's election. However, the Democrats are being criticized for pulling this move in an election year, which is in stark contrast to Donald Trump's proposal of mass deportations.
We will do large deportations.
Additionally, the path to U.S. citizenship takes roughly a decade. So the influx of immigrants during Biden's tenure will also not have a direct impact in this year's election. However, it will steer how Americans will vote this year, with border security remaining one of the top concerns. Meanwhile, both Elon Musk and Donald Trump continue to claim that the Democrats are signing up illegal migrants onto voter lists, even though they have not come forward with any evidence for their claims. Additionally, there is not enough research on whether migrants who get U.S. citizenship prefer to vote for Democrats or Republicans. So the fact still remains, despite these wild claims, that only American citizens choose their president.
The U.S. goes to polls on November 5th. The country will choose its next president. It will either be Kamala Harris from the Democratic Party or Donald Trump from the Republican Party. While there are other third-party candidates, the real race is between these two. So, who will vote for Harris? And who will try and bring Trump back to power?
Too much competition.
Right.
One way to look at potential voters is through the lens of race. The U.S. is home to more than 333 million people. This is according to the last census, taken in 2022. Now, let's break up that figure by race. About 58.9% of the U.S. population identifies as white. About 19.1% are Hispanic. Black people make up 12.6% of the U.S. population. Then, you have people of Asian descent who make up 6.1%. 2.4% of America is multiracial. 0.7% are Native American people. And Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders make up 0.2% of the population. That's the demographic breakup of the U.S. population according to the 2022 census. Let's look at the 4 biggest demographic groups, the ones most likely to influence the 2024 election. You have white people, Hispanic people, Black people, and people of Asian descent. In the last few U.S. elections, these 4 groups have made up 96 to 98% of the U.S. electorate. Look at this chart to see the composition of voters. You'll notice that it doesn't correspond to the population breakup. Even though white Americans make up less than 60% of the population, about 74% of the people who vote are white. This means white people have a disproportionately high say in the election compared to their population. Black voters come close to representing their share of the U.S. population, but Hispanic people and people of Asian descent do not have a proportional say. They have historically been underrepresented at the ballot box. So, while the 4 major racial groups do decide U.S. elections, white people have the biggest say by far. So how do the different American racial groups usually vote? We'll look at the last 4 elections for clues. These are the 2016 presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, then the 2018 midterms, the 2020 presidential election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and then the 2022 midterms. Here's the voter breakup by race for these elections. The most obvious difference is the percentage of white voters. White voters have made up about 62% of the Democratic Party's voter base. This is across the last 4 elections. In contrast, white people made up about 87% of the Republican Party's voter base. They are the driving force behind the Republicans, and it seems more white people vote for the GOP than for the Democrats. This has consistently been the case. Let's zoom in on the last election. In the 2022 midterms, 57% of all white voters choose the Republican Party, 41% voted for the Democrats, and 2% cast their votes elsewhere. So Republicans have the edge when it comes to white voters. But that edge is blunted when the black vote comes into play. Let's look at the 2022 midterm statistics again. A whopping 93% of all black voters chose the Democrats. 93%. And remember, black people are relatively well represented at the ballot box. So we can say that most black Americans vote blue. This has been proven time and again. In the last 4 elections, black people on average made up more than 17% of the Democratic Party's voter base. 17% versus only 1% on average for the Republican Party. Now we look at Hispanic people. They make up almost 20% of the US population. But when it comes to voting, they only make up about 9% of the electorate. It shows that Hispanic people are very underrepresented at the polling booth. But this 9% is still significant. It can turn the tide of any election. So Hispanic people are definitely a key demographic in the US. Like black voters, Hispanic voters traditionally lean towards the Democrats, but the difference in party choice is far less pronounced. Between 2016 and 2022, Hispanic people made up about 12% of the Democratic voter base on average. For the Republicans, this number was about half. About 6% of Republican voters over the last few elections have been Hispanic people. It's a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of the Democrats. But these numbers aren't set in stone. You'll notice that over time, Hispanic support for the Democrats has stagnated, whereas it has gone up for the Republicans. The swing is still minor, but this year's election could solidify the migration. And it proves that America's Hispanic population still has a big say in elections, even if it isn't proportional to the community's size. Then we have the people of Asian descent, America's fastest growing demographic. They make up only 6.1% of the population right now, according to the 2022 census. But that's 27% higher than the proportion of Asian people in 2010. So the population of Asian people in the US grew by 27% between 2010 and 2022. That's much faster than any other demographic group. If this growth continues, people of Asian descent will continue to have a greater say in American politics as the years go by. Historically, this is another group that has leaned towards the Democrats, even more than Hispanic people. In 2022, 68% of all Asian Americans voted blue, compared to 60% of all Hispanic voters. So both the groups lean towards the Democratic Party, but Asian Americans slightly more so. People of Asian descent made up about 4% of the Democratic Party's voter base over the last 4 elections. That fell to about 2% for the Republicans. But again, there's a caveat here. In 2016 and 2018, barely any Asian Americans voted red. But in the 2020 presidential elections, Asian American support for the Republicans surged. They made up 3% of the Republican voter base. It was a historic high. With Trump contesting again, more Asian Americans might be tempted to vote red once more.
Thank you, everybody.
So that's how the biggest racial groups in the US usually vote. White people lean towards the Republicans. Black people overwhelmingly vote for the Democrats. Hispanic people and people of Asian descent have historically voted in favor of the Democrats as well. But the gap seems to be narrowing. And this should worry Kamala Harris and encourage Donald Trump.
In the last few weeks, opinion polls have been dominating the headlines. In July, Kamala Harris had a comfortable lead in the polls, but those gains have since been erased. Trump and Harris are neck and neck in the latest polls. The question remains, can opinion polls really predict the election result? Do they accurately predict a result? The 2016 opinion poll got it wrong. The 2020 opinion poll was off in its predictions. Will the 2024 opinion poll get it right?
On November 5th, all eyes will be on America. The country will head to the ballot box, and they have a choice to make: Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. Who will the United States choose?
I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
I am running to be president for all of America, not half of America.
Now, no one can predict the election results. We will only know when it's declared. But behind the votes, there's another story, a story of numbers, statistics, and predictions. The story of polls. We hear about them during every presidential election. In some states, Donald Trump is leading. In the others, it's Kamala Harris. These polls are crucial to each election. They shape narratives. They influence campaigns. And sometimes, they even leave the entire nation baffled. In 2016 and 2020, the polls got it wrong. Can they get it right this time? And what do these opinion polls mean for the American democracy? The year was 1948. The date was November 3rd. This was the front page of the Chicago Daily Tribune. It read, "Dewey defeats Truman." But here's the catch. Thomas E. Dewey did not win that election. Harry S. Truman did. So why did the paper print that headline? A year before the elections, the Chicago Daily Tribune had changed the way it printed its paper. So the copy needed to go to print earlier. That was the case, too, on that night. Most states had not declared their results, but the paper took a leap of faith. After all, every poll said that Dewey would win. So they went ahead with this copy. It went to press. But by next morning, it was a completely different result. The polls predicted a Dewey win. Instead, it was a Truman triumph. He even posed with the Chicago Daily Tribune copy. Now, polling has been a part of American elections for over a century. It started with simple straw polls. As technology advanced, so did the methods. Now, they are complex statistical analyses. So, how do the polls work? It's all about three things: data, sampling, and the art of asking the right questions. At its core, a poll is a survey. It's a way to measure the opinions of a specific group. But in a country as large and diverse as the United States, it's impossible to ask everyone. So, pollsters rely on sampling. Age, gender, race, location. These are all factors that are considered before building a sample. Then there are the methods. How do you contact the sample group? Pollsters use landlines, cell phones, and online surveys. Each method has its advantages and drawbacks. More importantly, each one can influence the outcome of the poll. For example, imagine it's an online survey. Chances are the answers will come from a younger generation. Also, chances are they will be more educated. So, pollsters must keep that in mind. Once the data is collected, It's analyzed. It is then adjusted for various factors like non-response bias, which occurs when survey participants either can't or won't respond to a survey question. Finally, it is presented to the public as the polls that we see. So it's a science, but one with inherent uncertainties. Take 1980, for example, Jimmy Carter versus Ronald Reagan. Polls predicted a close race. However, Reagan won by a landslide. So why did the polls go wrong? It's the voter sentiment in the end. Reagan performed well in the presidential debate that was held a week before the election. It convinced many undecided voters. They ended up voting for him. And the polls completely missed this. Then there's 2000, George W. Bush versus Al Gore. Many polls predicted an Al Gore win. Now, while Gore did win the popular vote, the outcome depended on the Electoral College. Polls underestimated that. It did not take into consideration the razor-thin margins in key states. So it was a blot on the reputation of polls. But 2016 really changed the game. It's when America woke up to how wrong these polls could be. Polls predicted an overwhelming victory for Hillary Clinton. Yet on election night, Donald Trump emerged as the 45th president of the United States. So what went wrong? Well, there are several factors at play. The first was the underestimation of Trump's support in key battleground states. Pollsters missed crucial pockets of voters. That's the rural, white working class. They turned out in larger numbers than expected. The second was education levels. Non-educated voters weren't well represented in the samples, and they turned out to be pivotal in Trump's victory. The third was late deciding voters, those who swung towards Trump in the final days of the campaign. Polls didn't capture this last-minute shift. But here was the biggest issue: the failure to account for this shy Trump voter. These voters supported Trump, but were reluctant to declare it. Hillary may have lost the election, but the biggest loser of 2016 were the pollsters. So 4 years later, the polling industry vowed to learn from its mistakes. In 2020, the polls once again predicted a clear winner. It was Joe Biden. This time, the prediction was correct, but there was an issue. The margin was far narrower than expected. Despite making adjustments, pollsters underestimated Trump's support again. The problems were the same as 2016. So, what will it be in 2024? Pollsters are now looking at new technologies: AI, big data, and social media analytics. They want to use it to improve accuracy. But will it be enough? Will pollsters get it right this time? Or will they be wrong for the third time? Whatever the answer is, one thing is clear. Polls will remain a critical part of the presidential elections, but they are not infallible. And in the end, it's the people, not the polls, who ultimately decide who will be in the White House.
The US will elect its 47th president on November 5th, which is a Tuesday. They elected their 46th president on November 3rd in 2020, which was also a Tuesday. What about the 45th and the 44th presidents? Let me cut to the chase. Over the past 175 years, the US has always elected its president on a Tuesday, more specifically on the Tuesday following the first Monday in the month of November, every 4 years. When did this become a polling tradition and why? Our next report tells you.
If there's one thing the year 2024 will be remembered for, it'll be elections. From India to Britain, the European Union to South Korea, South Africa, Finland, France, Taiwan, and even Russia. Over 60 nations held elections this year. However, it's not over yet. One last global election remains, and it's just around the corner. The United States, the world's oldest modern democracy, is set to vote this November. Americans will be choosing their 47th president. And running for the White House are former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris. The presidential race in the US happens every 4 years. However, there is something constant in each election that has remained unchanged for over 175 years, and that is the day of the week when the elections are held: Tuesday. This year as well, Americans will be voting on November 5th, which is also a Tuesday. So why is Tuesday connected to America's democracy? Well, it's a bit of coincidence and tradition. The election day in the United States has been set in stone by federal law. The U.S. law calls for a presidential poll to be held on the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. But how did the November Tuesday become so important for U.S. democracy? Let's find out. The U.S. Constitution does not designate a specific day for holding elections. However, it allows Congress to select the time and day for choosing electors or delegates. These delegates, in turn, vote to elect the president and vice president. The Constitution also gives some rights to the states to choose the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives. However, it also permits Congress to make or alter those state rules. So if the day hasn't been fixed, then how did Tuesday come into the picture? The U.S. declared itself independent from Britain in 1776. The United States ratified its Constitution in 1788. This was followed by the first elections that were held between November of 1788 and June 1789. Yes, voting that is now done within one day took up to 6 months when it first began. And subsequent elections continued to be chaotic. Things changed more than 5 decades later when the 1840 presidential election saw widespread voting fraud. In response, then Representative Alexander Duncan proposed a uniform election day for both presidential and House elections in 1844. The bill initially sought to require all states to hold their elections on a single day. That is on Tuesday after the first Monday in November. While the House passed the bill, the Senate didn't table it before the 1844 election. Alexander Duncan reintroduced the bill in the next session, this time focusing solely on the presidential election. Various amendments were proposed during the bill's consideration. Ultimately, the House adopted the bill, and the Senate passed it with minor corrections. The bill was signed into law on January 23, 1845, by President John Tyler, making Tuesday the official day for Americans to vote for their president. But the mystery remains: why choose a Tuesday? Historians say the answer lies in 19th century American lifestyle. The choice of Tuesday in November is deeply rooted on the country's agrarian culture of the time. November was ideal because it followed the completion of the harvest season. The month also avoided conflicts with both planting in the spring and early fall. This meant that farmers could plant their crop and travel to vote, which would take days in those times. Additionally, Tuesday was chosen due to religious reasons. In Christian practice, the term Sabbath is often used to refer to Sunday. It recognizes the day of Jesus Christ's resurrection, and many Christians would observe a weekly day of rest and worship on Sunday. In the 19th century, polling stations were quite far from rural areas, and for voters, particularly farmers, it meant at least a day-long journey. So to avoid forcing people to travel on the holy day of Sabbath, Monday was not considered, and Wednesday, which was designated as the market day for farmers, was also rejected. Naturally, Tuesday emerged as the prime choice and eventually became the official day. However, Tuesday as an election day has had its fair share of opposition. Modern-day political experts say that voting on a weekend would see an increase in turnout. They argue that holding election on a Tuesday hinders voter access due to work commitments. One of the organizations leading the cause to reassign voting day is called Why Tuesday? Founded in 2005, the group raises awareness about America's low voter turnout. It aims to highlight the lack of accessible voting options, and they are leading the fight to move election day to the weekend. Many countries hold elections on weekends. Australia, Germany, France, and Japan generally conduct elections on Saturdays or Sundays. Brazil votes on the first Sunday of October, with runoffs on the last Sunday if needed. Meanwhile, Mexico shifted from the first Sunday of July to the first Sunday of June from 2021. The European Union also typically holds its parliament election on a weekend. However, in the Anglosphere, such as the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada, elections are typically held on weekdays. It is influenced by historical Christian practice of observing Sabbath. Meanwhile, in India, elections occur over multiple days with different phases for various constituencies. In the case of the United States, it's worth noting that while federal elections are on a Tuesday, state and local elections have more flexibility. However, many states align their elections with the federal date simply for convenience. On November 5th, the Tuesday after the first Monday of November, millions of Americans will line up at polling booths. They will exercise their fundamental right of self-governance. As for the Tuesday election day, the law that has continued for over 175 years faces little opposition and will likely remain for many more years to come.
They say clothes make a person. But when it comes to elections, clothes can also help make a president. And both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump know this. They're both using fashion as a soft power, from power suits to longer ties and brighter colors. How are Harris and Trump dressing to become the next commander-in-chief? And why does it matter? Also, is it a level playing field? Our next report discusses this.
This is the U.S. presidential race, where numbers matter, policies matter, but so do the optics. This is a grand theater of politics, where, like with any theatrical display, amid the pomp and pageantry, costumes can make all the difference. Why is that? And how do the candidates use it to their advantage?
Her biggest advantage is that she's a beautiful woman.
Don't you find some of their stuff to just be plain weird?
I'm a better looking person than Kamala.
Well, Donald, I do hope you'll reconsider.
August 23rd. This was one of the most consequential days for Kamala Harris, when she accepted her nomination as the Democratic candidate for president.
We can do together. We are so honored to be your nominees. This is a people-powered campaign, and together we will chart a new way forward.
While this happened, many women at the Democratic National Convention were wearing white. So were many other speakers. But Harris chose to wear blue. This wasn't just to stand out of the crowd. After all, a presidential candidate doesn't have to try very hard to do that. Here, her navy blue suit had symbolic meaning.
America's ready for a better story. We are ready for a president, Kamala Harris.
To understand this, let's go back. The year was 2016. History was made in the United States. The first woman candidate was nominated for president, Hillary Clinton. Clinton had climbed up the stage in a white suit. Why white? Because for her, this was symbol of all the women before her who fought for a political voice. From the suffragists to Geraldine Ferraro, the first woman vice presidential candidate. Since that moment in 2016, the white pantsuit is a symbolic weapon in the US. It is a political trope. Harris has used this weapon once before. In 2020, when US President Joe Biden declared the election victory, Harris became the first woman vice president of the United States. And she chose to wear white, again, in honor of the women who came before her.
I know where I stand, and I know where the United States belongs.
But this time, as Harris accepted her presidential nomination, she wore blue to close a chapter and stand out on her own terms. Because for her, wearing suits is not just an easy, obvious choice. It is tactical. Suits have become her uniform since before her days of vice presidency. Harris has appeared in neutral pantsuits, usually in shades of black, dark blue, burgundy, and beige. Now, power suits are kind of the go-to for US presidential candidates, so Hillary Clinton did it as well, as a self-described pantsuit aficionado, but usually in rainbow colors. This was her way to bridge the male-female fashion divide. But this doesn't mean everyone wears suits. Like former Republican presidential contender
Miss Nikki Haley!
She often wore dresses and skirts, especially during the Republican presidential debates, mainly to differentiate herself and stand out among the other Republican hopefuls. But why are we talking about this? Why does it matter what women presidential candidates wear? First, because they are in the presidential race, and a president doesn't dress to represent themselves, but the country, so the stakes are high. And secondly, because they are women. Studies show that when voters are asked to close their eyes and picture a US president, most of them come up with the same image, a white man.
Well, folks, it's time to turn the page.
So voters don't know what a woman in office looks like, let alone a potentially pioneering woman president, if elected.
I've served with her. I know her. I trust her.
Harris will be the first female president, the first female president of color, and the first president of South Asian descent.
But while I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last.
So voters don't know what a woman president will or should look like. But research confirms that they scrutinize a woman president's appearance more than a male candidate's. For instance, a flyaway hair is an indication of sloppy thinking. Is this unfair? Of course. Even former US President Barack Obama acknowledged the double standard when he spoke about Hillary Clinton. He said,
She had to do everything that I had to do, except, like Ginger Rogers, backward in heels. She had to wake up earlier than I did because she had to get her hair done. She had to, handle all the expectations that were placed on her.
and we witnessed the proof. When Clinton didn't do this, when she tied her hair in a ponytail, it led to an entire debate about the meaning of the scrunchie. So, as things stand, how Harris equips herself for the role matters, and better yet, she can use it to her advantage, and she has. Like when Harris wore 3 different black designers for President Biden's inauguration. But it is not just Harris who needs to worry about fashion. So does Donald Trump. The Republican presidential candidate Trump is almost always in a suit. By the Italian luxury brand Brioni, with a broad-shouldered tailoring.
And a tie.
And this tie is a tactical play as well. It is really long, which experts say is worn that way to make him look taller and thinner. And it is almost always red.
Why?
Because put together with a suit and tie, Trump looks like a walking, talking American flag. This is the look. His signature red tie, his white shirt, and his blue suit. Trump embraces these patriotic hues more than any of his predecessors.
Happy birthday, President Trump.
And the flag seems to be his muse. Because, fun fact, Trump's birthday falls on June 14, which also happens to be Flag Day in the US. Now, Trump wore the same combination even before he entered politics. But over time, his uniform has evolved.
I am the chosen one. Somebody had to do it.
the blue has become brighter in recent months, and the red ties have become even more common. Now, he is not alone here. Former U.S. President Ronald Reagan was also known for his red ties. This was symbolic of his Republican representation, but no one loves it like Trump. He does switch it up though, like during his New York hush money trial. He wore blue and gold ties. He was taking space from his political uniform. But he always reverts to the combination during the high-stakes events. He wore it in 2016 when he won the presidency. He wore it for his first official news conference as the president, for State of the Union addresses in 2019 and 2020, for his speech at January 6th rally in 2021, for his exit from the White House in 2021, for his mug shot, and even for his first official TikTok post. He wears the flag. He is surrounded by flags.
Why?
Experts say it is a visual representation of patriotism and nationalism. So, when people see him, they see the flag. So, in the run-up to November 5th, both Trump and Harris are using fashion as a soft power, albeit differently. But they both have the same goal. They have each devised their own wardrobe language. They are both power dressing for the job they want, to be the president of the United States, arguably the most powerful person in the world.
Well, that's all on this US election special. Don't forget to tune into First Post for all the election updates. Vantage will be coming to you live from the White House in Washington, D.C., starting next week.
Tonight, the high-stakes showdown here in Philadelphia between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. Their first face-to-face meeting in this presidential election, their first face-to-face meeting ever.
A historic race for president upended just weeks ago. President Biden withdrawing after his last debate. Donald Trump now up against a new opponent.
The candidates separated by the smallest of margins, essentially tied in the polls nationally and in the key battlegrounds, including right here in Pennsylvania, all still very much in play. The ABC News presidential debate starts right now.
This is an ABC News special, the most consequential moment of this campaign. Kamala Harris.
Together, we will chart a new way forward.
Donald Trump.
We will soon be a great nation again.
Face to face, historic. The ABC News presidential debate. Here now, David Muir and Lindsay Davis.
Good evening, I'm David Muir, and thank you for joining us for tonight's ABC News presidential debate. We want to welcome viewers watching on ABC and around the world tonight. Vice President Kamala Harris and President Donald Trump are just moments away from taking the stage in this unprecedented race for president.
And I'm Lindsay Davis. Tonight's meeting could be the most consequential event of their campaigns, with Election Day now less than 2 months away. For Vice President Kamala Harris, this is her first debate since President Biden withdrew from the race on July 21st. Of course, that decision followed his debate against President Donald Trump in June. Since then, this race has taken on an entirely new dynamic.
And that brings us to the rules of tonight's debate: 90 minutes with 2 commercial breaks. No topics or questions have been shared with the campaigns. The candidates will have 2 minutes to answer questions, and this is the clock. That's what they'll be seeing: 2 minutes for rebuttals and 1 minute for follow-ups, clarifications, or responses. Their microphones will only be turned on when it's their turn to speak. No pre-written notes allowed. There is no audience here tonight in this hall at the National Constitution Center. This is an intimate setting for 2 candidates who have never met.
President Trump won the coin toss. He chose to deliver the final closing statement of the evening. Vice President Harris selected the podium to the right.
So let's now welcome the candidates to the stage: Vice President Kamala Harris and President Donald Trump.
Kamala Harris.
Let's have a good debate.
Nice to see you. Have fun.
Thank you.
Welcome to you both. It's wonderful to have you. It's an honor to have you both here tonight.
Good evening. We are looking forward to a spirited and thoughtful debate.
So let's get started. I want to begin tonight with the issue that voters repeatedly say is their number one issue, and that is the economy and the cost of living in this country. Vice President Harris, you and President Trump were elected 4 years ago, and your opponent on the stage here tonight often asks his supporters, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? When it comes to the economy, do you believe Americans are better off than they were 4 years ago?
So I was raised as a middle-class kid, and I am actually the only person on this stage who has a plan that is about lifting up the middle class and working people of America. I believe in the ambition, the aspirations, the dreams of the American people. And that is why I imagine and have actually a plan to build what I call an opportunity economy. Because here's the thing. We know that we have a shortage of homes and housing, and the cost of housing is too expensive for far too many people. We know that young families need support to raise their children, and I intend on extending a tax cut for those families of $6,000, which is the largest child tax credit that we have given in a long time, so that those young families can afford to buy a crib, buy a car seat, buy clothes for their children. My passion, one of them, is small businesses. My mother raised my sister and me, but there was a woman who helped raise us. We call her our second mother. She was a small business owner. I love our small businesses. My plan is to give a $50,000 tax deduction to start up small businesses, knowing they are part of the backbone of America's economy. My opponent, on the other hand, his plan is to do what he has done before, which is to provide a tax cut for billionaires and big corporations, which will result in $5 trillion to America's deficit. My opponent has a plan that I call the Trump sales tax, which would be a 20% tax on everyday goods that you rely on to get through the month. Economists have said that Trump sales tax would actually result for middle-class families in about $4,000 more a year, because of his policies and his ideas about what should be the backs of middle-class people paying for tax cuts for billionaires.
President Trump, I'll give you 2 minutes.
First of all, I have no sales tax. That's an incorrect statement. She knows that. We're doing tariffs on other countries. Other countries are going to finally, after 75 years, pay us back for all that we've done for the world. And the tariff will be substantial in some cases. I took in billions and billions of dollars, as you know, from China. In fact, they never took the tariff off because there was so much money they can't. It would totally destroy everything that they've set out to do. They're taking in billions of dollars from China and other places. They've left the tariffs on. When I had it, I had tariffs, and yet I had no inflation. Look, we've had a terrible economy because inflation which is really known as a country buster. It breaks up countries. We have inflation like very few people have ever seen before, probably the worst in our nation's history. We were at 21%, but that's being generous because many things are 50, 60, 70, and 80% higher than they were just a few years ago. This has been a disaster for people, for the middle class, but for every class. On top of that, we have millions of people pouring into our country from prisons and jails, from mental institutions and insane asylums, and they're coming in and they're taking jobs that are occupied right now by African Americans and Hispanics, and also unions. Unions are going to be affected very soon. And you see what's happening. You see what's happening with towns throughout the United States. You look at Springfield, Ohio. You look at Aurora in Colorado. They are taking over the towns. They're taking over buildings. They're going in violently. These are the people that she and Biden led into our country, and they're destroying our country. They're dangerous. They're at the highest level of criminality, and we have to get them out. We have to get them out fast. I created one of the greatest economies in the history of our country. I'll do it again and even better.
We are going to get to immigration and border security during this debate, but I would like to let Vice President Harris respond on the economy here.
Well, I would love to. Let's talk about what Donald Trump left us. Donald Trump left us the worst unemployment since the Great Depression. Donald Trump left us the worst public health epidemic in a century. Donald Trump left us the worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. And what we have done is clean up Donald Trump's mess. What we have done and what I intend to do is build on what we know are the aspirations and the hopes of the American people. But I'm going to tell you all in this debate tonight, you're going to hear from the same old tired playbook, a bunch of lies, grievances, and name calling. What you're going to hear tonight is a detailed and dangerous plan called Project 2025 that the former president intends on implementing if he were elected again. I believe very strongly that the American people want a president who understands the importance of bringing us together, knowing we have so much more in common than what separates us. And I pledge to you to be a president for all Americans.
President Trump, will give you a minute here to respond.
Number one, I have nothing to do, as you know, and as she knows better than anyone, I have nothing to do with Project 2025. That's out there. I haven't read it. I don't want to read it purposely. I'm not going to read it. This was a group of people that got together. They came up with some ideas, I guess some good, some bad, but it makes no difference. I have nothing to do. Everybody knows I'm an open book. Everybody knows what I'm going to do. Cut taxes very substantially and create a great economy like I did before. We had the greatest economy. We got hit with a pandemic. And the pandemic was not since 1917, where 100 million people died, has there been anything like it. We did a phenomenal job with the pandemic. We handed them over a country where the economy and where the stock market was higher than it was before the pandemic came in. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. We made ventilators for the entire world. We got gowns, we got masks, we did things that nobody thought possible. And people give me credit for rebuilding the military. They give me credit for a lot of things, but not enough credit for the great job we did with the pandemic. But the only jobs they got were bounce back jobs. These were jobs bounced back, and it bounced back and it went to their benefit. But I was the one that created them. They know it, and so does everybody else.
Vice President Harris, I'll let you respond.
So Donald Trump has no plan for you. And when you look at his economic plan, it's all about tax breaks for the richest people. I am offering what I describe as an opportunity economy, and the best economists in our country, if not the world, have reviewed our relative plans for the future of America. What Goldman Sachs has said is that Donald Trump's plan would make the economy worse. Mine would strengthen the economy. What the Wharton School has said is Donald Trump's plan would actually explode the deficit. 16 Nobel laureates have described his economic plan as something that would increase inflation and by the middle of next year would invite a recession. You just have to look at where we are and where we stand on the issues. And I'd invite you to know that Donald Trump actually has no plan for you because he is more interested in defending himself than he is in looking out for you.
That's just a soundbite. They gave her that to say. Look, I went to the Wharton School of Finance, and many of those professors, the top professors, think my plan is a brilliant plan. It's a great plan. It's a plan that's going to bring up our worth, our value as a country. It's going to make people want to be able to go and work and create jobs and create a lot of good, solid money for our country. And just to finish off, she doesn't have a plan. She copied Biden's plan, and it's like 4 sentences, like run, spot, run. 4 sentences that are just, oh, we'll try and lower taxes. She doesn't have a plan. Take a look at her plan. She doesn't have a plan.
Mr. President, I do want to drill down on something you both brought up. The Vice President brought up your tariffs. You responded, and let's drill down on this because your plan is what she calls is essentially a national sales tax. Your proposal calls for tariffs, as you pointed out here, on foreign imports across the board. You recently said that you might double your plan, imposing tariffs up to 20% on goods coming into this country. As you know, many economists say that with tariffs at that level, costs are then passed on to the consumer. Vice President Harris has argued it'll mean higher prices on gas, food, clothing, medication, arguing it costs the typical family nearly $4,000 a year. Do you believe Americans can afford higher prices because of tariffs?
They're not going to have higher prices. What's going to have and who's going to have higher prices is China and all of the countries that have been ripping us off for years. I was the only president ever. China was paying us hundreds of billions of dollars, and so were other countries. And, you know, if she doesn't like them, they should have gone out and they should have immediately cut the tariffs. But those tariffs are there 3.5 years now under their administration. We are going to take in billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars. I had no inflation, virtually no inflation. They had the highest inflation perhaps in the history of our country because I've never seen a worse period of time. People can't go out and buy cereal or bacon or eggs or anything else. The people of our country are absolutely dying with what they've done. They've destroyed the economy. And all you have to do is look at a poll. The polls say 80 and 85 and even 90% that the Trump economy was great, that their economy was terrible.
Vice President Harris, I do want to ask for your response. And you heard what the president said there, because the Biden administration did keep a number of the Trump tariffs in place. So how do you respond?
Well, let's be clear that the Trump administration resulted in a trade deficit, one of the highest we've ever seen in the history of America. He invited trade wars. You want to talk about his deal with China? What he ended up doing is under Donald Trump's presidency, he ended up selling American chips to China to help them improve and modernize their military, basically sold us out, when a policy about China should be in making sure the United States of America wins the competition for the 21st century, which means focusing on the details of what that requires, focusing on relationships with our allies, focusing on investing in American-based technology so that we win the race on AI, on quantum computing, focusing on what we need to do to support America's workforce so that we don't end up having on the short end of the stick in terms of workers' rights. But what Donald Trump did, let's talk about this, with COVID, is he actually thanked President Xi for what he did during COVID. Look at his tweet. Thank you, President Xi, exclamation point, when we know that Xi was responsible for lacking and not giving us transparency about the origins of COVID.
President Trump, I'll let you respond.
First of all, they bought their chips from Taiwan. We hardly make chips anymore because of philosophies like they have and policies like they have. I don't say her because she has no policy. Everything that she believed 3 years ago and 4 years ago is out the window. She's going to my philosophy now. In fact, I was going to send her a MAGA hat. She's gone to my philosophy. But if she ever got elected, she'd change it. And it will be the end of our country. She's a Marxist. Everybody knows she's a Marxist. Her father's a Marxist professor in economics, and he taught her well. But when you look at what she's done to our country, and when you look at these millions and millions of people that are pouring into our country monthly, where it's, I believe, 21 million people, not the 15 that people say, and I think it's a lot higher than the 21. That's bigger than New York State pouring in. And just look at what they're doing to our country. They're criminals. Many of these people coming in are criminals. And that's bad for our economy, too. You know, you mentioned before, we'll talk about immigration later. Well, bad immigration is the worst thing that can happen to our economy. They have, and she has, destroyed our country with policy that's insane. Almost policy that you'd say they have to hate our country.
President Trump, thank you. Lindsay?
I want to turn to the issue of abortion. President Trump, you've often touted that you were able to kill Roe v. Wade. Last year, you said that you were proud to be the most pro-life president in American history. Then last month, you said that your administration would be great for women and their reproductive rights. In your home state of Florida, you surprised many with regard to your 6-week abortion ban, because you initially had said that it was too short. And you said, quote, I'm going to be voting that we need more than 6 weeks. But then the very next day, you reversed course and said you would vote to support the 6-week ban. Vice President Harris says that women shouldn't trust you on the issue of abortion because you've changed your position so many times. Therefore, why should they trust you?
Well, the reason I'm doing that vote is because the plan is, as you know, the vote is, they have abortion in the 9th month. They even have, and you can look at the governor of West Virginia, the previous governor of West Virginia, not the current governor, who's doing an excellent job, but the governor before, he said the baby will be born and we will decide what to do with the baby. In other words, we'll execute the baby. And that's why I did that, because that predominates, because they're radical. The Democrats are radical in that. And her vice presidential pick, which I think was a horrible pick, by the way, for our country, because he is really out of it. But her vice presidential pick says abortion in the 9th month is absolutely fine. He also says execution after birth. It's execution, no longer abortion, because the baby is born, is okay. And that's not okay with me, hence the vote. But what I did is something for 52 years. They've been trying to get Roe v. Wade into the states. And through the genius and heart and strength of 6 Supreme Court justices, we were able to do that. Now, I believe in the exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother. I believe strongly in it. Ronald Reagan did also. 85% of Republicans do. Exceptions. Very important. But we were able to get it, and now states are voting on it. And for the first time, you're going to see, look, this is an issue that's torn our country apart for 52 years. Every legal scholar, every Democrat, every Republican, liberal, conservative, they all wanted this issue to be brought back to the states where the people could vote. And that's what happened. Now, Ohio, the vote was somewhat liberal. Kansas, the vote was somewhat liberal, much more liberal than people would have thought. But each individual state is voting. It's the vote of the people now. It's not tied up in the federal government. I did a great service in doing it. It took courage to do it. And the Supreme Court had great courage in doing it. And I give tremendous credit to those 6 justices.
There is no state in this country where it is legal to kill a baby after it's born. Madam Vice President, I want to get your response to President Trump.
Well, as I said, you're going to hear a bunch of lies, and that's not actually a surprising fact. Let's understand how we got here. Donald Trump hand-selected 3 members of the United States Supreme Court with the intention that they would undo the protections of Roe v. Wade. And they did exactly as he intended. And now in over 20 states, there are Trump abortion bans, which make it criminal for a doctor or nurse to provide health care. In one state, it provides prison for life. Trump abortion bans that make no exception even for rape and incest, which understand what that means. A survivor of a crime of violation to their body does not have the right to make a decision about what happens to their body next. That is immoral. And one does not have to abandon their faith or deeply held beliefs to agree. The government, and Donald Trump certainly, should not be telling a woman what to do with her body. I have talked with women around our country. You want to talk about this is what people wanted? Pregnant women who want to carry a pregnancy to term, suffering from a miscarriage, being denied care in an emergency room because the healthcare providers are afraid they might go to jail, and she's bleeding out in a car in the parking lot. She didn't want that. Her husband didn't want that. A 12 or 13-year-old survivor of incest being forced to carry a pregnancy to term. They don't want that. And I pledge to you, when Congress passes a bill to put back in place the protections of Roe v. Wade, as President of the United States, I will proudly sign it into law. But understand, if Donald Trump were to be reelected, he will sign a national abortion ban. Understand, in his Project 2025, there would be a national abortion, a monitor that would be monitoring your pregnancies, your miscarriages. I think the American people believe that certain freedoms, in particular the freedom to make decisions about one's own body, should not be made by the government.
Thank you, Vice President Harris.
Well, there she goes again. It's a lie. I'm not signing a ban, and there's no reason to sign a ban because we've gotten what everybody wanted. Democrats, Republicans, and everybody else, and every legal scholar wanted it to be brought back into the states, and the states are voting. And it may take a little time, but for 52 years, this issue has torn our country apart, and they've wanted it back in the states. And I did something that nobody thought was possible. The states are now voting. What she says is an absolute lie. And as far as the abortion ban, no, I'm not in favor of abortion ban, but it doesn't matter because this issue has now been taken over by the states.
Would you veto a national abortion ban if it came to your desk?
Well, I won't have to because, again, two things. Number one, she said she'll go back to Congress. She'll never get the vote. It's impossible for her to get the vote, especially now with the 50-50 and essentially 50-50 in both Senate and the House. She's not going to get the vote. She can't get the vote. She won't even come close to it. So it's just talk. You know what it reminds me of? When they said they're going to get student loans terminated, and it ended up being a total catastrophe. The student loans, and then I think probably her boss, if you call him a boss, he spends all his time on the beach. But look, her boss went out and said, we'll do it again. We'll do it a different way. And he went out, got rejected again by the Supreme Court. So all these students got taunted with this whole thing about this whole idea and how unfair that would have been. Part of the reason they lost to the millions and millions of people that had to pay off their student loans. They didn't get it for free, but they were saying it's the same way that they talked about that they talk about abortion.
But if I could just get a yes or no, because your running mate, J.D. Vance, has said that you would veto it if it did come to your desk.
Well, I didn't discuss it with J.D. In all fairness, J.D., and I don't mind if he has a certain view, but I think he was speaking for me, but I really didn't. Look, we don't have to discuss it because she'd never be able to get it, just like she couldn't get student loans. They couldn't get student loans. They didn't even come close to getting student loans. They taunted young people and a lot of other people that had loans. They can never get this approved. So it doesn't matter what she says about going to Congress. So wonderful. Let's go to Congress, do it. But the fact is that for years, they wanted to get it out of Congress and out of the federal government. And we did something that everybody said couldn't be done. And now you have a vote of the people on abortion.
Vice President Harris, I want to give you your time to respond. But I do want to ask, would you support any restrictions on a woman's right to an abortion?
I absolutely support reinstating the protections of Roe v. Wade. And as you rightly mentioned, nowhere in America is a woman carrying a pregnancy to term and asking for an abortion. That is not happening. It's insulting to the women of America. And understand what has been happening under Donald Trump's abortion bans. Couples who pray and dream of having a family are being denied IVF treatments. What is happening in our country? Working people, working women who are working one or two jobs, who can barely afford childcare as it is, have to travel to another state to get on a plane sitting next to strangers to go and get the health care she needs. Barely can afford to do it, and what you are putting her through is unconscionable. And the people of America have not, the majority of Americans believe in a woman's right to make decisions about her own body. And that is why in every state where this issue has been on the ballot, in red and blue states both, the people of America have voted for freedom.
Vice President Harris,
excuse me, I have to respond. another lie. It's another lie. I have been a leader on IVF, which is fertilization. The IVF, I have been a leader. In fact, when they got a very negative decision on IVF from the Alabama courts, I saw the people of Alabama and the legislature 2 days later voted it in. I've been a leader on it. They know that, and everybody else knows it. I have been a leader on fertilization, IVF. And the other thing, you should ask, will she allow abortion in the 8th month, 9th month, 7th month?
Come on.
Okay, would you do that? Why don't you ask her that question?
Why don't you answer the question? Would you
because
veto?
Under Roe v.
Answer
Wade,
the question, would you veto?
you could do abortions in the 7th month, the 8th month, the 9th
That's
month,
not true.
and probably after birth. Just look at the former governor of Virginia. The governor of Virginia said, we put the baby aside and then we determine what we want to do with the baby.
President Trump, thank you.
We're going to turn now to immigration and border security. We know it's an issue that's important to Republicans, Democrats, voters across the board in this country. Vice President Harris, you were tasked by President Biden with getting to the root causes of migration from Central America. We know that illegal border crossings reached a record high in the Biden administration. This past June, President Biden imposed tough new asylum restrictions. We know the numbers since then have dropped significantly. But my question to you tonight is, why did the administration wait until 6 months before the election to act? And would you have done anything differently from President Biden on this?
So I'm the only person on this stage who has prosecuted transnational criminal organizations for the trafficking of guns, drugs, and human beings. And let me say that the United States Congress, including some of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, came up with a border security bill, which I supported. And that bill would have put 1,500 more border agents on the border to help those folks who are working there right now overtime, trying to do their job. It would have allowed us to stem the flow of fentanyl coming into the United States. I know there are so many families watching tonight who have been personally affected by the surge of fentanyl in our country. That bill would have put more resources to allow us to prosecute transnational criminal organizations for trafficking in guns, drugs, and human beings. But you know what happened to that bill? Donald Trump got on the phone, called up some folks in Congress and said, kill the bill. And you know why? Because he'd prefer to run on a problem instead of fixing a problem. And understand, this comes at a time where the people of our country actually need a leader who engages in solutions, who actually addresses the problems at hand. But what we have in the former president is someone who would prefer to run on a problem instead of fixing a problem. And I'll tell you something, he's going to talk about immigration a lot tonight, even when it's not the subject that is being raised. And I'm going to actually do something really unusual, and I'm going to invite you to attend one of Donald Trump's rallies, because it's a really interesting thing to watch. You will see during the course of his rallies, he talks about fictional characters like Hannibal Lecter. He will talk about windmills cause cancer. And what you will also notice is that people start leaving his rallies early out of exhaustion and boredom. And I will tell you, the one thing you will not hear him talk about is you. You will not hear him talk about your needs, your dreams, and your desires. And I'll tell you, I believe you deserve a president who actually puts you first. And I pledge to you that I will.
Vice President Harris, thank you. President Trump, on that point, I want to get your response.
Well, I would like to respond.
Let me just ask, though, why did you try to kill that bill, and successfully so, that would have put thousands of additional agents and officers on the border?
First, let me respond as to the
Please.
rallies. She said people start leaving. People don't go to her rallies. There's no reason to go. And the people that do go, she's bussing them in and paying them to be there, and then showing them in a different light. So she can't talk about that. People don't leave my rallies. We have the biggest rallies, the most incredible rallies in the history of politics. That's because people want to take their country back. Our country is being lost. We're a failing nation. And it happened 3.5 years ago. And what's going on here, you're going to end up in World War III, just to go into another subject. What they have done to our country by allowing these millions and millions of people to come into our country, and look at what's happening to the towns all over the United States. And a lot of towns don't want to talk. It's not going to be Aurora or Springfield. A lot of towns don't want to talk about it because they're so embarrassed by it. In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. And this is what's happening in our country, and it's a shame. As far as rallies are concerned, as far as the reason they go is they like what I say. They want to bring our country back. They want to make America great again. It's a very simple phrase, make America great again. She's destroying this country. And if she becomes president, this country doesn't have a chance of success. Not only success, we'll end up being Venezuela on steroids.
I just want to clarify here. You bring up Springfield, Ohio, and ABC News did reach out to the city manager there. He told us there have been no credible reports of specific claims of pets being harmed, injured, or abused by individuals within the immigrant community.
Well, I've seen people on television.
Let me just say here, this is
the people on television say my dog was taken and used for food. So maybe he said that, and maybe that's a good thing to say for a city manager.
I'm not taking this from television.
But the people
I'm
on
taking it from
television
the city
saying their
manager.
dog was eaten by the people that went there.
Again, the Springfield city manager says there's no evidence of that. Vice President Harris, I'll let you respond to the rest of what you've heard.
You talk about extreme. This is, I think, one of the reasons why in this election, I actually have the endorsement of 200 Republicans who have formerly worked with President Bush, Mitt Romney, and John McCain, including the endorsement of former Vice President Dick Cheney and Congress member Liz Cheney. And if you want to really know the inside track on who the former president is, if he didn't make it clear already, just ask people who have worked with him. His former chief of staff, a 4-star general, has said he has contempt for the Constitution of the United States. His former national security advisor has said he is dangerous and unfit. His former Secretary of Defense has said the nation, the republic, would never survive another Trump term. And when we listen to this kind of rhetoric, when the issues that affect the American people are not being addressed, I think the choice is clear in this election.
President Trump, I'll give you a quick minute to respond here.
Thank you, because when I hear that, see, I'm a different kind of a person. I fired most of those people. Not so graciously. They did bad things or a bad job. I fired them. They never fired one person. They didn't fire anybody having to do with Afghanistan and the Taliban and the 13 people whose were just killed, viciously and violently killed. And I got to know the parents and the family. They didn't fire. They should have fired all those generals, all those top people, because that was one of the most incompetently handled situations anybody has ever seen. So when somebody does a bad job, I fire him. And you take a guy like Esper, he was no good, I fired him, so he writes a book. Another one writes a book, because with me they can write books, with nobody else can they? But they have done such a poor job, and they never fire anybody. Look at the economy, look at the inflation. They didn't fire any of their economists, they have the same people. That's a good way not to have books written about you. But just to finish, I got more votes than any Republican in history by far. In fact, I got more votes than any president, sitting president in history by far.
Let me continue on immigration. It was what you wanted to talk about earlier. So let's get back to your deportation proposal that the vice president has reacted to as well. President Trump, you call this the largest domestic deportation operation in the history of our country. You say you would use the National Guard. You say if things get out of control, you'd have no problem using the U.S. military.
Police, yes.
You also said you would use local police. How would you deport 11 million undocumented immigrants? I know you believe that number is much higher. Take us through this. What does this look like? Will authorities be going door to door in this country?
Yeah, it is much higher because of them. They allowed criminals, many, many millions of criminals. They allowed terrorists. They allowed common street criminals. They allowed people to come in, drug dealers, to come into our country. And they're now in the United States and told by their countries like Venezuela, don't ever come back or we're going to kill you. Do you know that crime in Venezuela and crime in countries all over the world is way down? You know why? Because they've taken their criminals off the street and they've given them to her to put into our country. And this will be one of the greatest